Before I even begin here, one quick note. Jesus is speaking rhetorically, advocating the prioritizing of spiritual over physical needs. Jesus' teachings here also predate germ theory by a couple millennia, give or take. And unlike anyone in this room and anyone alive today, Jesus had the power to heal all manner of infirmity and even death with a touch or a word. All this is to say, I know Jesus is saying here that hand washing is overrated, and in his context, he is absolutely right. In our context, wash your hands. Wash them often. Wash them for at least 20 seconds with soap and warm water. Wash them as often as possible to keep everyone safe. Okay, now that that's been said, I won't lie to you. Earlier this week, I told several coworkers that I was preaching on the part of the Bible where Jesus teaches us not to wash our hands, just so I could see the confusion on their faces. This is one of the weirder teachings of Jesus. It's not like cursing fig trees weird or using his spit to heal blindness and then the guy sees trees walking around weird, but it's up there. And that's not a matter of contextual difference. It was weird when he said it to the people to whom he said it. Hand washing was an established ritual at the time. Moreover, we are not used to seeing Jesus so completely cast aside Jewish teaching and ritual as in this passage. Often when his actions are questioned, Jesus instead posits that he is elevating Jewish teachings. When his healing on the Sabbath is questioned, for example, rather than saying that the Sabbath is unimportant, he teaches that it is better to do good on the Sabbath than to be indifferent and allow evil to be done thereby. Here, though, Jesus actually appears not to care much for ritual hand washing, though it was a part of his tradition as well. Jesus' remarks appear similar to what in contemporary terms we would call a whataboutism. As in, sure, Trump isn't perfect, but what about the Democrats doing? Insert straw man here. This rhetorical strategy is rightly maligned and seen as a way of deflecting by changing the subject to distract from the flaws of the people and positions we support. One could easily critique Jesus' rhetorical strategy here on the same basis. The difference, I would contend, is that Jesus, in this case, already knows full well that the Pharisees and scribes don't actually care about the hand washing in the first place. In his landmark text, The Prophetic Imagination, Walter Brueggemann introduces us to what he calls the royal consciousness. That is the mindset that enables and supports the forces of authoritarian rule. Whether that be Pharaoh, the Romans, King Solomon, or indeed the United States as well, Brueggemann holds that the powers of empire tend to embrace a certain way of thinking, largely upheld by three principles: economics of affluence, politics of oppression, and, for tonight, religion of immanence. Now, an immanent God, which is to say a God who is near and who takes action in our world, is not usually seen as a negative thing. But Brueggemann holds that divine immanence and accessibility exist in a negative correlation with divine freedom. He points out that in the era of Moses, when we can clearly see God takes decisive action on behalf of the Hebrew people, God's freedom is emphasized. God does what she will, regardless of what her people or any people would prefer that she do. On the flip side, however, God's accessibility is dramatically downplayed here. You may note, for instance, that God's people are forbidden from seeing her on pain of death. God in this time lives on a mountain, distant and removed and mysterious to her people. In contrast, in the era of the Pharisees, God's mystery does not factor in. God has communicated at length what is expected of the Israelites. These expectations are known, and the Pharisees and other religious officials act as arbiters of God's will. There's the rub. As long as religious officials stand in between God and her people, God's freedom is inhibited, as it's subject to the whims of the priests. And we all know full well that when humankind become the arbiter of God's will becomes compromised. The very fact that the Pharisees are able to tell those in their community what they must do to please God means God is not free in this culture to contradict them. Ironically, it's an even more immanent God, made incarnate through Jesus Christ, that counteracts this. Though they themselves would deny it, the Pharisees have in Jesus a very immanent God who also has the freedom and agency to tell them what is good and right and what the Lord requires of them. Moreover, Jesus is a God who can see that the Pharisees care not for ritual hand-washing as religious ritual, but as a form of control. This is why Jesus, seemingly changing the subject, addresses not hand-washing, but the hypocrisy of the Pharisees, the fact that they violate their own commandments, and most importantly, that they police symbolic religious act in the powerless of their context, while looking the other way when faced with the very tangible evil that exists in their society, which actively harms and kills the powerless. What Jesus says by rejecting the rebuke of the Pharisees is that they are focusing on the wrong things. They embrace their religious tradition as a way of controlling the population rather than liberating them. They focus on the external acts of ritual that allow them to continue to monopolize the divine. Jesus, instead, focuses first and foremost on the liberation and empowerment of the poor and powerless. He cares for religious ritual, but cares more for his people being cared for and caring for others in turn. The sins he lists, the ones that come from the defilement of the heart, are those that cause tangible harm to members of the community: murder, slander, lies, adultery, theft. There are no victimless crimes here. Jesus prioritizes the protection of people above religious ritual, and prioritizes undoing tangible, harmful sin over maintaining symbolic religious act. Though, just to emphasize this again, not washing your hands is not a victimless crime in our current context and could very well end lives, so wash your hands. I promise I'm done with those. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the royal consciousness is not unique to biblical times and settings. We all know and see those who embrace a God of immanence without freedom. The God who has passed down her commands in Scripture that can neither be argued against nor granted the slightest bit of nuance. The God who prioritizes praise songs over justice and purity over empathy. The God who claims to be a God of love and grace, but somehow can't be bothered by children in cages on the southern border or people starving in the streets. This practice of setting up systems and ritual to keep God's people oppressed is not unique to religion either. You're probably all familiar with George Orwell's fascist dystopian novel 1984. Slightly less popular than this is the appendix to the same book in which Orwell lays down the vocabulary and grammar of Newspeak, the invented language favored by the English Socialist Party, thereby giving us a glimpse of the mechanics of fascism and censorship. Said language, Orwell wrote, was specifically engineered to make thoughts of human rights and freedom inexpressible and therefore unthinkable. For instance, though the word free exists in Newspeak, it is impossible to apply this sense of freedom to human individual will. One is able to say that one's dog is free from ticks, or that one's garden is free from weeds, but there is literally no way of communicating that a person is free to act. The powers of empire love systems like this because they grant ways for the forces of authoritarianism to control their citizens without appearing to do so. I could tell you so many stories of the way I see these systems in action every single day. I can tell you that it is near impossible to secure housing for a person living on the street without identifying documentation. This seems like a small requirement to us in the room. When you're a person on the streets, already lacking in energy and organizational skills, these are a significant barrier. In addition, if one, for instance, was born in the state of Florida, they can't request a new birth certificate without sending a copy of their state ID to prove their identity. They also cannot obtain a new state ID without an original form of their birth certificate. So this person continues to live in agony, facing the risks of exposure and violence every day because of a bureaucratic technicality. And that's if they were lucky enough to be born in a different state. If they were born outside of this country, it is ridiculous. Should anyone question this bureaucratic technicality, they will be told that these are the rules, and they cannot be altered. Rules are rules. It is overlooked that these rules, and indeed all rules, were made by humans, and anything that has been made by humans can be undone or altered by humans. Because the people who dictate these rules and standards are conveniently invisible and would like to keep it that way. These rules are treated as an unalterable law of nature rather than a barrier set up by humankind that leaves other humans vulnerable and suffering. And just for the record, I'm currently referencing one of the more common and less devious examples of this solely because I'm concerned I will get in trouble if I say too much about something else. There are thousands of examples of systems like this in our own context and others, and they vary in intensity, but each functions to keep the powerless disempowered while obscuring the people who are disempowering them. But to return to the example at hand, the Pharisees had a number of these systems in play as well in their context of the Roman Empire. And that we often see Jesus debating them on their own terms. In this example, he rejects those systems altogether. What he tells the people is that these outward systems have nothing to do with morality, that they should instead focus on the inner life, on themselves, on their own outlooks and attitudes, and the ways they may be keeping themselves and others oppressed and disempowered. And just to drive the point home, the immediately following story shows Jesus violating his own systems to help a woman who deserves it. The story of the Canaanite woman can often be hard for theologians and preachers to deal with because we're not used to Jesus changing his mind like this. It doesn't happen a lot. I've seen a number of homiletical approaches to address this philosophical about face, but what I think is that the placement of the story is key. Immediately after the story in which Jesus critiques the Pharisees for putting their religious systems, rituals, and traditions on a pedestal while leaving their people in the dust, Jesus initially cites his own systems and tradition, only to violate them immediately after. I can't think that's a mistake. I think rather Jesus made a point of saying that healing the Canaanite woman's daughter would violate his own system of belief before doing so precisely to put his miracle where his mouth is, to show that he not only preaches this but acts it. Even though it may seem to render him a hypocrite to those who have eyes to see and ears to hear, it actually shows just how very much Jesus is sticking to his own teachings. Now, our own time is no stranger to this royal consciousness or the systems of belief that seem to serve religion while actually undoing its liberative purpose. We clearly are among those who have learned that there is a deeper and truer way of seeing faith in at least one respect. We ourselves are precisely a class of people who have been nearly undone by religious systems. But day by day, still there are more and more people of God learning that the liberative purpose of religion means accepting and loving the stranger more than we prize our own traditions. If there's one lesson to learn from the Gospels, it is that Jesus, the God who is both near us and free, who has both immanence and agency, always, always, always comes to show us that there is a truth and love that is higher than the religious systems we've built. He did this in his own time and is still doing so today. And I ask that we may all be a part of the same work. May we all be aware that the word we have heard from God is not the last word. May we embrace a God who is immanent and active in our world and who is also free to act against us when we, as all people, find our own systems of belief keep some among us oppressed and disempowered. And may we be bold enough to say that if Jesus himself can see that his system of belief is leaving a woman suffering and change his mind, we are also free to do the same. Thank you.